I'm very happy that that we can have this debate today. We are in the midst of a climate conference in Glasgow. We will talk about both conference, the implications of that summit for the region and for the world more globally. And we will also talk a little bit about the region itself, whether the question of climate justice is, which is so much one of the key points of the conference itself, whether Central Eastern Europe can be somehow somehow also put in this group of the countries which need support in terms of cutting emissions and becoming greener and such. So for these two major issues, we have our two speakers to debate them. Albin Sybera, who is the author of one of the contributions to the special issue of Res Publica, and Suzana Carp, who is the climate expert and has had a long career in the issues of climate, environment, and so on. So with that, let me just move immediately to Suzana. If I can ask Suzana, whether you're optimistic about what you're seeing in Glasgow, whether you think that we can expect a major breakthrough, whether the world will really agree on cutting the emissions so radically that we will get to the target of 1.5 degree above the pre-industrial levels. Is it a realistic goal? Is it too late? And can we be optimistic about what's going to happen in Glasgow?
Good afternoon, all, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. The questions are super interesting, and they're actually the questions on everybody's minds at this point in time. So I'll try to answer them to, let's say, the best knowledge that I have today, but we're still in the first week of COP, so we're still expecting to see sort of the developments that unfold all the way to the end. However, I think we do have reasons to be optimistic, and as you said, the word breakthrough, I know that's because, in a way, this has been one of the themes for this COP, breakthroughs. And we've seen massive alliances emerging on, let's say, steel. And today, in the context of the Energy Day, we've seen alliances emerging around coal. So, it's not a small thing that countries such as Poland have also announced a coal phase out today. But of course, bigger countries around the world have joined forces. So to some extent, whether or not we'll be able to stay within 1.5 degrees, it is a question around kind of how we utilize the next couple of years. So you asked whether we can expect to see radical cut in emissions. I'm afraid not, and I think we have reasons, or I have reasons to be afraid that we won't see the radical cuts that we would need to stay in 1.5. We're still going to see a progressive approach, but nonetheless, we are seeing an increase, and I think that's an important element of why these conferences are taking place. So there is an inspirational element to them. There is the idea that obviously we can't, no continent can do it alone, but together we could do it. And I think that's what we're seeing as a trend at this COP, that we're having a lot of unexpected announcements and a lot of actors stepping forward. So it is quite encouraging. But I think it is beginning to be late for 1.5, which isn't to say we shouldn't try our very best to still aim for it.
Okay, thank you, Suzana. Albin, are you optimistic about the outcome of the conference itself and about the region, whether Central and Eastern Europe will join in this group of states which are very ambitious in setting the goals and will actually deliver also? Because it's one thing that we have to mention here is that this is the conference that everybody declares things. But the actual action is not necessarily being followed through. As which is what happened after the Paris conference. We had this, the breakthrough conference in Paris in 2016. Everybody made, the declarations, and not everybody delivered. So Albin, what is your take on this issue? Will we deliver this time, and will Central Europe join the club of the climate progressivists?
Thank you very much for the chance to speak here. I'll start with the optimistic note. I'm first of all excited to see a conference where we see such a mass political presentation, even actually doing so much to address this issue, which, as Suzana was mentioning, perhaps is too late, but nevertheless, I think it's still some reason for optimism. Yet, when I return to the region which I'm following the most, which most specifically is the Czech political scene, I don't see it that optimistically right away, even during the conference already. There's been very low debate on environmental issues, which has been going on for years, I have to say. We've just had election finished, and the campaign that was preceding the election itself was very sadly quite characteristic for incredibly low debate on environmental issues, where as one very prominent environmental commentator, Jan Rovensky of Greenpeace, observed, it was basically a race between politicians who were racing in an insane way of ignoring the climate issues and racing at who will do this more insanely, if I were to use his words. And unfortunately, I have to subscribe to this, because following the election campaign in the Czech media, not only that we saw some of the tropes that are characteristic for the Czech climate debate, which, just to mention a couple of them, includes the shedding doubts on the effectiveness of renewable resources, of sort of describing nuclear energy as a securitization of the energy market in the Czech Republic. Also, here I have to note that the Czech Republic is a country where nuclear energy combined with coal accounts for more than 80% of the energy mix. So this also stems from a very specific environment, I would say, where for a couple of decades we have seen 2 or 3 major energy players who are firmly rooted in this energy environment. And what the energy transformation that this country very much needs, what it means for them is that they will have to quickly either give up their dominant position or radically give room to decentralization, which is obviously against their business interests. So talking about, I think to some extent I can see something similar in other V4 countries. So I think one thing I would really point out is that unfortunately we still have not seen the potential that the V4 countries have towards the climate change, and I am not sure if we will see it, which is pessimistic, I know, but this is the best I can do too.
Okay, thank you, Albin.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's it's pessimistic, but perhaps also realistic. However, I think that one of the things that the conferences like that is doing is very educational. I think that all of us learn about how much the climate has been warming, and what are the key ingredients of this process. For example, actually cutting CO2 emissions may in initial years lead to the further warming of the climate, because the CO2 is also producing a lot of sulfur, and sulfur is actually making the climate cooler. So when we cut CO2, for the first initial reaction of the climate would be actually further warming. And that's why a group of countries have signed up the the document, the pledge to cut the emission of methanol. And here is a question to you, Suzana. How important is this, this pledge in cutting methanol, in addition to cutting CO2? How important it is in the whole process of the, addressing the climate change issue?
Okay, so I would say it's hugely important, also because it's actually one of those greenhouse gases from which the ozone layer can recover quicker. So that means that the sooner we cut methane, and that's why it's been such an important step forward that we've seen the methane pledge over the past couple of days at COP, but effectively that can yield results in the next decade. Now, it's also really important because it means a lot for the way that we have, let's say, we think about value chains of certain energy products we use. So, for example, unfortunately, the accounting we use nowadays for emissions is rarely takes into account emissions all throughout the value chain. So now the pledge on methane also means that when we will be talking about natural gas and when we will be, let's say, talking about importing it, we will also have to account for the methane emissions. And therefore, it actually creates a very relevant, more realistic picture of the sort of energy landscape we have now. So it's really long overdue, much needed, can yield quick results. But the key element is, as you said towards the end of your question, in addition to cutting CO2. So there is this temptation for some to say, let's focus on methane now, let's forget about the CO2. But actually, we absolutely are at the stage where we need to be focusing on both rapidly. So I think the methane pledge is a huge step forward, should have happened long ago, still could be implemented very quick as well, because for methane reduction, there are technologies available that are really important, and they could be deployed at scale. So that is something we could achieve in the next few years even. Plus it will change the way we account for greenhouse gases, which is very good. But eyes focused on CO2. Unfortunately, we have to not lose the big picture.
And here, but do you agree with that? That actually, the initial result of cutting CO2 would be further warming?
No, not necessarily, because the strange thing in a way about climate change, that's why we don't call it global warming, we call it climate change, is that actually it creates the sort of systemic chain reactions we're looking at and that the scientists are concerned about. The reason why we have 1.5 is that they're actually unpredictable. So the reason why humanity is now striving for 1.5 is because that was considered sort of the point where humanity could still manage the systemic risks that emerge. Now, above that, it's considered unmanageable risk, and it's unmanageable also because of its unpredictability. And let's not forget that climate in its expression through, let's say, weather is still felt at the local level. So even when you have situations where you have very warm month, let's say in the Arctic, but then it's extremely cold elsewhere, or all that water that vaporizes then pours, there's downfalls and pouring rain and drought, the opposite of drought, floods elsewhere. So actually, it's such a complex system that I wouldn't agree with that statement, even if, and the question is that even relevant insofar as what we're trying to do is to stabilize the climate?
Okay, thank you. And my further questions, which is a follow-up from that, and I don't know whether you, Suzana, or you, Albin, can take that. It's about like the implications of, this pledge of cutting methane. Because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong with that, means that that means actually that all this massive switching into the producing the energy from gas, from the as opposed to petrol, as opposed to coal, may actually not be such a great idea now, because it's the electricity produced from the gas sources, which is the major producers of methane. So that could be one issue there. And the other issue, it requires far-reaching changes in agricultural sector, because it's agricultural sector which is responsible for the quite substantial production of methane. by implication, meaning that within some space of decades, we will all become vegetarians and vegans, really. So Suzana or Albin? Well, maybe Albin. Do you see Czechs becoming vegetarian very easily and in the next decades? So your knedlíky will no longer be come together with a piece of meat.
There is actually a vegetarian form of knedlíky if you stuff it with strawberries or plums, which is also very popular in the country. It also, unfortunately, requires...
I have not tried this one. I'm not quite sure I want to.
But it requires a lot of butter as well. So again, we're back with the cows, which of course, if I go back to what you mentioned with this educational aspect, it's something that I think really needs to be addressed in the region, because also what I was mentioning earlier with sort of these stereotypical tropes that are associated with a climate change, and as you mentioned, the example, the sort of fear that the Czechs or Slovaks, for that matter, as far as I know, will have to become vegetarians. The way this trope is developed in media discourse, as well as in politics, unfortunately, is it's taken at face value. It's not so much considered that let's even talk about our dietary habits, but ultimately let's look at the most frightening scenario, and that's why we want to be more rationalistic, and that's why we don't want to do it. So I would really hope that I will see somewhere a really thorough educational approach to the way we discuss climate change in Central European societies. But instead, what I'm seeing is that it's really being abused in a way, and for cultural wars and political fights, and also for and this I would really warn against, a form of alienating society towards the EU, which is increasingly being associated with environmental policies, as opposed to the pork eating Czechs.
Thank you. Well, Suzana, I don't know whether you want to contribute to this question with your expertise. Also, I was wondering whether you can actually elaborate a little bit more on the issues of the required changes in our lifestyle, because it's not just food. Actually, food is probably the one which we would all feel mostly, but also the issues of transport, air travel, and such. What can you tell us about that? And before you respond, I just want to remind everyone that we will be finishing up recording in a moment, and you can raise hands yourself, or you can write to me on a chat here, and then we want to collect questions from yourself. So it shouldn't be just a discussion between myself and our two great panelists. So Suzana, over to you. Tell us about how our lifestyle will change.
Well, I can begin by telling you how much our lifestyle has changed over the past year and a half. And I should point to the fact that many studies indicate that pandemics are extremely likely when you actually have proximity between sort of agriculture and kind of industrialized agriculture, and encroaching upon ecosystems and biodiversity, getting very close to human communities. So it's actually, as far as I understand what's been written so far about the current pandemic, which is not necessarily going to be the very last one. If that's sort of if this linkage is confirmed. But the idea would be that, unfortunately, as we're in the middle of a pretty big extinction when it comes to biodiversity, we've actually sort of unsettled the balance, our environmental balance globally so much that actually even what we're going through right now, which has asked all of us to change fundamentally our lifestyles in an incredibly short amount of time, is a result of this imbalance. So whether or not Central Eastern Europe will be all vegetarian, I guess, in a way it touches on the second question, which is that the moment you start reconsidering the policies and your ecosystem, your urban ecosystem and the policy ecosystem around what we're trying to preserve and what we're trying to safeguard with these policies, you end up having some lifestyle changes. Now, I don't know if there's always this tension in climate policy. Should we put the focus on individuals or on the big polluters? My answer to that is always on the big polluters. Because individuals will follow. And, the idea is that if you actually think of how much choice you have as an individual, you realize you very often don't have very much choice. So you can't actually, let's say, make fully informed decisions about some of the products that you buy. And then you don't really have an option of buying a zero carbon emissions, bottle or, so it's very complicated. But having said that, I think when it comes to transport and buildings, the built environment, we are going to see some fundamental changes in the next, I would say, 10 to 15 years. That's not only because the internal combustion engine is on its way out, partly as a result of initiatives from the European Commission, but also because of the developments in the market. So one thing I want to stress here is that very soon, by 2030, very likely, we will have a point in time where the economic choice will be buying an electric car. And what I don't want to see happening at that stage is the old fleet of cars from, let's say, Western Europe being shifted into Central Eastern Europe because citizens in Central Eastern Europe can't make the economic choice of buying an electric car because their governments have not been building the infrastructure as they should have, having had all the money over the past decade. So I think that's the big dilemma that Central Eastern Europe is in. And of course, this terrain is appealing to politicians. It was appealing to Mr. Babic, even when the pandemic started, didn't go well with his statements. But the point is, of course, it's attractive for politics and for populism. Of course, it's easy to say, oh, maybe renewables are this and that. But the reality of the matter is, this money that's available on the table for an infrastructural upgrade that enables the transition won't come again for the same sector. So you have to use it or you lose it. And I'm afraid that Central Eastern Europe, just because it maybe dances a bit too much with the idea that we're going to ignore these bigger global changes, might be in a situation where it's lost. And then, in the 2030s, we won't be talking about investing in the same things. And, so yes, we will be changing our lifestyles, but I think in many ways, consumers could be and citizens could be informed and informing themselves, most importantly, and also really taking part in this and pressuring their politicians as well to do the right thing, because the global economics is changing. So we don't want to be left outside of that.
It's a great point. I don't think that, but actually, that has occurred to many people in Central Eastern Europe that will be actually flooded with the Western petrol and diesel cars. Yeah, we had that immediately after the end of communism. This is what happened. That the second-hand, usually quite old cars were flooding the market here. And we probably will have a repetition of that towards the end of the decade, when the Western Europe is switching into electric cars. So it's probably inevitable. But yes, that's a really good point. Now, Albin or Suzana, I don't see anybody raising a hand. So I will just be abusing my position here, and I will be drawing some further, expertise from yourself. First of all, it is really the question of where are we going to get our electricity from? Because it's like, especially a country like Poland, 70% of our energy mix is coal. can we depart from it within like 20 years time? Is it like really feasible? Who's gonna pay for it? And you know, so that's where the question of the climate justice is coming in here. Who's gonna pay for it? And still, in terms of the per capita emissions, Central Europeans are not actually polluting as much as Western Europeans. So that's number one here. Number two is, you know, if coal is bad, gas is probably not great either because of the, you know, methane. You know, the Germans don't like nuclear power plants. So we can't all run on, like, you know, sun and wind, can we?
I'll quickly make this note. I don't want to be pessimistic again, but I think what the unfortunate thing is that some of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they really wasted a lot of their opportunities in the past years. And of course, as we discussed, this has to do with the education, but perhaps one point that I don't see, and there's also a potential for development, is a closer cooperation with these countries, but not the kind of cooperation we've been accustomed to seeing on the big rhetorical level between the V4 countries and the regional populists, but more on connecting the opportunities that individual countries have, be it solar and wind. But again, as you said, it's at this moment, unfortunately, I don't want to use the word unrealistic, because this is exactly what I've been criticizing in the past, is that the large energy companies in the Czech Republic, they've turned this term unrealistic into a slogan, into a phrase with which they've been able to influence the public discourse in the country against the renewables. But unfortunately, within a couple of last years, by repeatedly doing this, they really brought the situation to the point where it might seem that they will get what they want, and that is enhancement of nuclear energy and perhaps even more of their talk of gas as, what they like to say, transitory state before the eventual energy transformation. But I absolutely agree with you that this is not the way, but it's unfortunately the reality of the region to some extent.
Thank you. Suzana.
Yes, I found Albin's comment very interesting, and I will try to build on it. But I should also say that I also come from the region. So I'm from Romania. I've also studied climate and energy policies in Poland, in Warsaw. And I will share with you something I've shared with the Romanian audience a week ago. They had this event, Romanian Energy Days. And you know, the question when we look for 2050, because we know 2050 net zero is legally binding now with the EU climate law. And if you think about subsidiarity and proportionality, it will mean that it will also be net zero at member state level. So if you were to start your net zero portfolio, let's say you start from scratch today, and you look at the prices of technologies today, the costs, well, you'd very clearly start from wind and solar. And you'd put a lot of wind and solar, but you'd also maybe consider options to balance the system. But those options would have to be net zero, right? Because you want to keep them in 2050. So I don't know, does that mean gas with CCS? Does that mean nuclear? Does that mean hydro geothermal? I mean, this is how we need to start thinking about that, because that is the end point. Now, of course, we're not starting from scratch, but in the end, that's where we end up. And when you look at the costs, you know, Marcin, you've asked a very interesting question: who's going to pay for this? But I want to ask, who's going to pay to keep coal online until 2040, despite the global economics of coal pushing it out? I mean, it's going to be taxpayers. And at the same time, you have an interesting thing that's happening in renewables and batteries, is that the decrease in costs is constant. And that is a reflection of the constant advancements in the technology. So you almost already know that this is just going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And so then it's going to become increasingly difficult to even justify why keeping something online is more economically profitable than building something new, that is much cheaper and zero emissions. So that's a bit the predicament. Now, this whole thing on realism, I find it quite interesting because I've been in the climate debate, maybe not for as many years as others have, but for sure, I mean, there was this point in time where even talking to, let's say, the European institutions, there wasn't a consensus that the EU needed a EU Green Deal. And they thought that climate campaigners were being unrealistic. But, it's 2021. We've had a EU Green Deal for 2 years now. Who's been in denial? This was long time coming. So I think there's twisted images of what reality is, but I think, if you depart from kind of the evidence around how serious climate change is, then that almost becomes the only reality to which you can really report when you can connect to when building ahead, because it's not going to disappear. Everything else might shift, and that's partly why the EU ETS is doing so well, because the only certainty we've got in this massive uncertain times we're going through is climate change is here to stay.